pile of beaver skins as high as the musket upright, from the base of the musket on the ground to the top of the barrel standing upright. So that would be a pile of beaver skins that high would trade for one musket. You can see how in need of guns and ammunition the people were, but also you can see that there was a trading relationship that was very valued on both parts. The furs were highly valuable in Europe. Beaver skins could bring, as when one of the companies, the American Fur Company or the Northwest Company or the Hudson's Bay Company, when they invested money to acquire skins, they could have 1,000% return. Of course, there was danger in acquiring the furs, and there was danger in shipping them by boat, but nevertheless, there was very high profit. And from the Indians' point of view, not only guns, but other articles like pots and pans and later canvas, these became very valuable items. It made their lives easier. It made fewer people able to survive. It made villages more mobile. A lot of the villages that had been occupied only in the summer months became occupied by at least some people in the winter months in order to get winter pelts. So when the fur trappers got to our area, they traded with the Methow people. There are some estimates that the beaver and other large game in the Methow Valley may have been almost completely depleted by the 1830s. So you see it coming back by the 1880s, when the first white people really begin to settle in the area. So that's a little background on population, and I think it's important for us to remember that the first white people, the first Europeans that saw the tribes in the Pacific Northwest, saw a greatly depleted tribe, where a vast number of people had already died. There are reports, especially from down by the mouth of the Columbia, reports that Europeans came upon villages where the tribe was completely gone. Everyone had been killed by smallpox. So, and I wanted to mention, it's important to understand how the smallpox was transmitted. It wasn't transmitted by Europeans to the Indians up here. They were infected by other Indians. There was extensive trade. There were networks of trade, and there was a lot of the relations between the various tribes up and down the Columbia and over the Rocky Mountains into the Great Plains. So we know now that the epidemics that reached here in the 1770s, the smallpox epidemics, reached here from two directions. One, from the mouth of the Columbia. It went from village to village. The smallpox was infected village to village up the Columbia, all the way up, clear up the Columbia drainage and into the Shuswap territory and up into the Fraser drainage. So the whole portion of western British Columbia and all of the Columbia Plateau had a great depopulation from that smallpox in the 1770s. And so the Indians, when the first Europeans arrived in the 1810s, 1810 to 20 to 2025, they had already suffered great population loss, but they had never really seen a European, and they didn't really know where the disease was coming from. However, they learned very quickly. They figured it out very quickly, and in this area by 1820, they understood that the smallpox and the other diseases probably came with the white people, and so their reports of tribal members up and down the Columbia being very careful about having contact with whites because they didn't trust them, because they thought disease would come from them. The first Jesuits arrived in the region in the 1830s in the Upper Columbia. They came with the Hudson's Bay Company. They came with Hudson's Bay Company trapping parties. And one of the things that they reported was that they promised tribal members who converted that they would inoculate them. Conversely, those people that didn't convert didn't get inoculated. So it was Father de Smet, who wrote about this, said this turned into a very good strategy. If they joined the church, they lived, and if they didn't join the church, they died. It's unknown how widely this was practiced, but in the 1830s and 40s under de Smet, it seems to have been practiced in the Columbia Plateau area. You have to keep in mind, however, although smallpox vaccine was essentially discovered around 1800, by the early 19th century in Europe, medical texts were explaining how a vaccine could be made and why, and they didn't know why it worked, but they knew how it worked. And in BC, in British Columbia, and along the coast of what would become the Northwest United States, there were occasional uses of vaccine among Indians when the Indians were in close proximity to settlements of whites. In the Southwest, the Spaniards actually started using some vaccine with the Pueblo tribes because they viewed the Pueblo tribes as allies against the Apaches and the Navajos, and so they wanted to keep them alive. That was especially along the Rio Grande. But up here, a vaccine was unavailable to tribal members in the United States and BC well into the early 20th century, and in the United States through the 19th century it was unavailable. So second tribe I'm going to talk about today, the Sinixt, who lived over on the Columbia in the North Columbia, one of the big reasons they moved down to the Colville Reservation from British Columbia was that the priests there offered them inoculations. And they understood perfectly well what the difference between conversion and inoculation was by that time. So with all that in mind, I was going to talk for a little while about the Methow people, and then a little bit about the Sinixt people. So the Methow, some of you have already heard this, both tribes were living in very remote areas relative to United States settlement. And the Methow tribe, their territory was set aside as part of the Moses Columbia Reservation in 1879. And Moses was a leader of the Sinkius, a tribe that lived over on the other side of the Columbia on what we would call now the Waterville Plateau, and some of the drainages over there. They did acquire the horse, and they had a lot of horses and used the horse. They did eat salmon, and they ate camas, a lot of the same foods, but they, as you know, lived in a drier climate. Moses was partly educated at a white school and could speak English. He may have been able to read a little bit. And he was smart. And he negotiated with General O.O. Howard, who had seen a lot of death in the Civil War and seen a lot of death in the attack or the chase of Joseph Nez Perce up toward Canada. And Howard wanted to avoid another Indian war, and Moses threatened to cause another Indian war. Moses said he could represent all of the tribes in the region, a fact that was probably untrue. But nevertheless, Howard was able to get Washington to establish a reservation for Moses. It became known as the Moses-Columbia Reservation. It was essentially an extension of the Colville Reservation. The Colville Reservation was made in 1872 and included all the land in between the Columbia River and the Okanagan River in the United States. So if you can imagine the Columbia River coming down by the town of Colville out of British Columbia, and then doing a big loop and coming over and having a confluence with the Okanagan not too far from where we live. Everything inside that big loop was part of the Colville Reservation originally. The Moses-Columbia Reservation went essentially from the crest of the Cascades over to the Okanagan River, from the international boundary from Canada down to the south shore of Lake Chelan. So the Methow people, imagine they had lost, 75, 90% of their population. They had tried to survive using trading with the fur company, especially the Hudson's Bay Company. And they had learned how to use guns and ammunition, and they were good hunters. And then along comes the United States moving in with new colonial ideas. The fur trappers were not interested in acquiring Indian property, so they just had a trading relationship. The United States wanted to acquire and wanted to have immigrants come out and settle in these areas. So one of the very first orders that Governor Isaac I. Stevens, the first American governor of the territory of Washington, one of his first orders was that there could no longer be any trading of arms or ammunition with tribes. Now, he ostensibly feared violence. He feared the Indians would try and protect their lands and prevent settlement by white people. From the Indians' point of view, it was more taking away their ability to hunt. So it was a big part of their subsistence that they were losing. So just looking at the time, I'm going to quickly go over to the Sinixt. So that to sum up what happened with the Methow, eventually Moses was the white people decided they wanted the Moses-Columbia Reservation, and Moses was willing to negotiate again with the United States and was paid, and his people were paid. So Moses is a hero among his own people and kind of a villain among the Methow and the Chelan and the Wenatchee and some of the other people that he said he represented, but which he didn't really represent. So the Moses-Columbia Reservation was opened in 1886, and that's when non-Indians really began to legally settle in this valley. To the east, the Sinixt, or as they were often known, the Lakes, the Sinixt had, as I said, they had been really decimated by smallpox. They probably lost 95% for sure of their population. There had been 3,000 or 4,000 of them along the upper Columbia, and they were reduced to 200 or 300 by the 1860s. Smallpox epidemics were still coming into that area, and they really wanted to have inoculations. They really wanted to be vaccinated. The Jesuit priests promised them that if they would come down and move to the Colville Reservation in the United States, they could get inoculated, and they would also have help to learn how to farm. So they did move down, first settling in the Colville Valley, and they were moved out of the Colville Valley and moved to the other side of the Columbia, a place called Kelly Hill, where they started farms again with help from the priests. And then the north half of the Colville Reservation was eliminated, taken from them, and they were moved down by today's town of Injaleon. Then when Grand Coulee Dam was constructed, it flooded the Indian community at Inchelium, and they had to move all their farms and their houses up elevation to get out of the flooding. So they had been moved, they moved out of BC, they moved out of the Colville Valley, they moved out of the Kelly Hill area, and then they had to move a fourth time from the flooding from Grand Coulee. So to me, it's pretty amazing. Here are these people who had maybe 90% of their population eliminated by disease. They had to move 4 times, and yet there they are, they're still there, and they're still a tribe. They still have organization, they're still fighting for their rights. Today, what they have done is they have filed suit in Canada. When Canada started building hydroelectric dams along the upper Columbia, just like in the United States, they were supposed to consult with the tribes that had Aboriginal territory where the dams were being constructed. In order, I mean, I can't really prove why Canada did what it did, but right at that particular moment, the Canadian officials declared the Sinixt tribe extinct. And that way they didn't have to consult with them. So the Sinixt tribe had been trying for many years. I started working on this matter, I think about 10 or 15 years ago. And finally, we got into court in 2015. There was a trial where the tribe said we have the right to hunt and fish in our Aboriginal territory under Canadian law. And the court ruled that they were not extinct and that they did have rights to hunt and fish in their Aboriginal territory. So that case went on appeal. The Crown, the federal government of Canada, appealed it, and it is currently before the Canadian Supreme Court because of the current pandemic. The Canadian Supreme Court has postponed decisions on this particular case. We hope that we'll see a decision sometime in the fall now. And at some point, once we get that decision, there will be another lawsuit filed where the tribe will attempt to determine the extent of their Aboriginal territory at time of contact. Under Canadian law, which is different from US law, but under Canadian law, history becomes very important. The Aboriginal territory is determined on the basis of first-hand information from 1811, the point of first contact with David Thompson and other fur traders, and 1846, the time of the Oregon Treaty, when Canada and the British possession, Canada as a British possession, the boundary was set, at least theoretically, between the British possessions and the United States. It was a long time before it was surveyed, and that was a long time before it was made final. But I'm just looking at the time. I know that I was supposed to leave some time for questions, so I've tried to move hurriedly along through this period in the tribes, but I'm open to any questions. I see one question.
Anybody have any questions? You have to unmute yourself.
Oh, Bill must have some questions.
Come on, Bill.
Well, I have a question.
Raise your hand.
Okay.
I don't know. I think I unmuted myself.
Yes, you did. I can hear you.
So this period of time of this introduction of, or this decimation of the native peoples, first of all, it's kind of, I didn't get a strong scientific sense of us really knowing the population size or there being any real definitive ways to determine that. But is there a possibility that any of this decimation of the native population was caused by something other than a European introduced pandemic?
I think currently the belief is that the depopulation was almost entirely from disease. There are a few tribes that suffered significant statistical depopulation from violence, but disease was by far the greatest cause of the depopulation. So in Mexico, there were, in the 16th century, they kept they kept very close accounts of the population. I mean, they were making a lot of money. You're quite correct that, I mean, as I said, in North America, there's a great deal of dispute about what the population was, the pre-contact population was. However, there is almost no dispute now. Everyone agrees that at least from the late 18th century to the early 19th century, there was a depopulation of 75%. It may have been 95%, and it may have occurred over a couple of hundred years rather than just 20 or 30 years. But there have been a lot of archaeological studies on particular areas. There was a woman who did her PhD dissertation about 35 years ago, who studied the pandemic of the early 16th century, and she looked at archaeological sites throughout North America and Central America and could see a dramatic period of depopulation around the early 16th century throughout the region. So there are those that believe that there was depopulation as early as the early 1500s, when the first smallpox, we have lots of evidence of this smallpox occurring in the 1519 to 1525 area period in Central America and in Latin America, in South America, and in the southern portion of North America. There's a great deal of evidence of that. In fact, one of the Aztec codices even talks about it. So there was politically a lot of reason to justify a low population in North America, and there still is. There's still people that argue that in BC. There are fewer in Canada because they're still dealing with treaty rights up there. That a lot of things got more settled down here. There's less debate now. Dobbins was kind of regarded as a kook in the 1960s, and now is regarded as being a very stable and prominent figure in demography. Did that answer your question?
Yes, it did. Yeah, just one more kind of clarification. So it seems like it's pretty well accepted that there was an extreme decline in population, and some of it can be traced directly to smallpox, as you're saying, in the early 16th century. And so if there was this large, pretty dramatic decimation, the fact that it was disease, not a lack of food or terrible climate events, whatever, something external, probably wouldn't have that big of a dramatic impact on a population as disease would. The thing that's interesting to me is, it's like, again, do we know it was a disease that wasn't started here? I don't really know how diseases get established in the first place, and certainly coming, the Europeans coming from a totally different environment with different immunity, that's the most direct way that you could introduce a pandemic. But I was just an interesting thing of whether it could have been something local.
Yeah, there are a lot of epidemiological studies. There were other diseases, as I mentioned, influenza, measles, especially, killed a lot of people. Smallpox, the records, we pretty much are going, but the demographic studies are going pretty much by European observations. So we know when smallpox hit a settlement, a white settlement, we know how many white people died, and we have a good idea of the percentage of loss of non-white people in the vicinity. There are good records of that after Europeans arrive. What we don't have a good record of, and which archaeology is the only way to answer, is prior to European arrival. So because Europeans didn't arrive up here until 1811, we have no other way to look at depopulation than through archaeology. It's interesting, I mean, with the Sinixt, we have hired an archaeologist to look at population density changes through the centuries in those archaeological sites, Sinixt archaeological sites that still exist. And the archaeologists, of course, are interested. They've looked at the population fluctuations over many centuries. And it's interesting that, Jane, that they have seen fluctuations, population fluctuations related to previous climate changes. So it does affect salmon, it does affect camas, it does affect all of their sources of subsistence. It did affect all of their sources of subsistence, and it did affect population. And there's, I can't remember the dates, but there is one very large fluctuation that is, I think, related to climate change. But from the 16th century to today, I think that the demographic experts are in agreement that the great depopulation occurred as largely as a result of smallpox, as well as other diseases. And you know, as you noted, I mean, the Indians had no, you can't develop an immunity or resistance to these diseases in a few generations. Europe had you know, thousands of years. So the Indians had no immunity, although it does seem like the smallpox in particular came in waves. It would hit one generation and then it would seem to skip a generation and then hit the next generation. And there's speculation about what the cause of that is, why that occurs, but there was no immunity that was transmitted to children over, at least over more than one generation.
Thank you.
Do you have any verbal historical accounts from the Indians themselves talking about this period and what their memory is or what happened?
Yes, well, I mean, at least from 1800 on, there a lot of it, they have not been systematically researched, and they should be. But there are a lot of accounts by Indians, especially provided to fur trappers in the Columbia Plateau, in the upper Columbia Plateau, about the effects of disease. And there are actually quite a few accounts from the 1810 to 1820 period where they talk about a great epidemic that occurred about 40 or 50 years prior to that. So, but oral tradition doesn't usually reach back for centuries. You know, it's pretty good for 40 or 50 years.
Mm-hmm.
It depends on the kind of mechanisms a particular tribe has for remembering things. In the Southwest, I know at Zuni, where I worked for a number of years, they had kinds of information that they had to memorize verbatim. And that was done in the kivas, in their religious structures, and in the social structure of the kivas as well. So they had a mechanism to remember certain things, and they had memories. They had, you know, family stories and clan stories, but they also had these religious stories that became very important to them. But even when it came to oral history, even their memory didn't go back much more than 50, 60 years. So we have a lot of memory, a lot of tribal statements about disease from the late 18th century to today. But before that time, in this area, we have almost nothing. It's interesting. I don't know. Some of you may have heard of the Indian woman whose English name was Mourning Dove, Mourning. And she wrote about the fact that her people had moved. She was talking about her Sinixt roots, that her people had moved out of BC and down to the reservation because they couldn't get any kind of inoculation or vaccination for smallpox in British Columbia, and they had better health care on the reservation in the United States.
I noticed that Bill was talking, but I couldn't hear you, Bill. Are you unmuted? I still can't hear you. Huh? Can't hear you. Yeah, you appear to be unmuted, but I can't hear you. Sorry. Darn. Something must be wrong with his system.
Deetra, this is Jan. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
And because if he's on a computer, there's something he has to do, or he doesn't have sound installed in his computer, which he can get, whoever that person is.
Yeah, he's using Diana's computer, I believe, and she has had sound before because she did some storytelling. Maybe your sound on your computer is not on, Bill? Yeah, we still can't hear you. Huh. I can see you're talking, but we can't hear you. Sorry.
Well, let me just say a little bit more about archaeological evidence. The problem is even greater in the Northwest because the materials that tribes used don't last. In the Southwest, you had pottery and thousands of years of pottery, so there was a lot of material to work with, archaeologically speaking. But up here, instead of pottery, we had baskets. Sometimes the baskets were lined with materials and you could actually boil water in them, but nevertheless they still deteriorate, and after a couple of winters not much is left. So they have to use other techniques to determine how many people might have lived in a structure, or statistically in all structures within the territory. One of the things they look at is the animal remains. So you see great amounts of salmon that were consumed through the winter and through the summer. But also I was interested in one of the Sinixt villages that got excavated recently. They had a huge amount of immature beaver remains. So they lived in what at that time was a kind of a wetlands. So apparently there were a lot of beaver, and they harvested young beaver, which doesn't sound all that palatable to me, but they ate what was available. Was that people didn't trust white people to be telling them the truth. In other words, they weren't sure when they were told you should have social distancing and you should wear masks and so forth. They weren't sure that was really legitimate information because they have a long history of not trusting white people. And in the Southwest, among the Pueblos in particular, and also the Navajo, there is a very strong tradition that if somebody's sick, everybody should go over and pay their respects and try and pray for them and help them recover. And of course, this gets everybody infected. So social distancing has been a real problem in the Southwest.
They have the highest amount in our county, the Colvilles do right now, of infected people, right? No? Was that wrong?
I think they've been pretty good. I think that initially they had quite a few cases, and now they're protecting themselves pretty well.
Yeah. Okay, I have that wrong.